Hey everybody, Professor Reed. Want to give you a little update on the essay we're working on. A couple things I'm going to do. I'm going to upload probably 3, 4 examples of the essay. Really take a look at them, sort of see stylistically how they went about doing them. Really interesting subject matters. I think one is on workout culture. So they highlight some really interesting transitions from essay one to this second essay, looking at themes that are connected together. There's another one that's on this idea of cults, and it looks at sort of complicated cults of the 1970s, and a really interesting connection there with the Jim Jones cult that happened down in Guyana, famously culturally sort of known for the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid, although that is a misnomer that I've always wondered about if Kool-Aid Inc. had an issue with, because I think it was actually Flavor Aid. But anyway, I digress there for a second. Really good paper that's on cults and really transition from like the People's Temple, I think it was called. And I'll put a few more up there just to take a look at and get a feel for the essay as a whole. But what I want to do is just talk briefly about the essay. So some things to keep in mind. Think about this and look at the example thesis ideas that are in the essays. The thesis is trying to argue a position, and think about it sort of like over time, right? So if you were looking at something like genetically modified food, that's going to be a paper that I've had a couple on for in terms of this type of essay. And what the students will sometimes argue is genetically modified food over time has expanded its scope, and at the same time, sort of the marketing image of it can be pretty maligned, and therefore leading to people not using it for the maximum type of efficiency. So, like, the idea is that if we sort of embraced genetically modified food, we could actually make a more sustainable, that's the right word, sustainable food source system. And students have argued that in multiple papers, just one that comes to the top of my head. And they're looking at making an argument about something sort of over time. Because the idea of the paper is you're taking two of the forensic sources that are about like an expanse over time. Like, so they're looking at the idea of information in the past. Okay. Now it can be a primary source, so keep that in mind. Like, the primary source could actually be, if you look at the anti-vaccination movement, for example, you could actually look at what people were saying with the anti-vaccination movement. I want to say that the Puritans actually debated, I want to say Cotton Mather, who was a pretty famous pilgrim, debated if the vaccinations for the smallpox vaccines were good or bad. Don't quote me on that one, but I do also know that George Washington used or implemented the inoculations for smallpox, and some people argue that's one of the reasons why the Americans won the war there in 1776. So, well, they didn't win the war in 76. They won the Revolutionary War, I should say. Okay, so take a look at some of these, thesis statements out there, but think about them sort of they're over amount of time they're making an argument, because really forensic sources are about the past, and remember, you can use a primary or a secondary source. So you could actually, for anti-vaccination, you could use an article that talks about the sources from the past. The epididic source, remember, that's going to be a more popular based source, and those can gravitate towards a little bit more on the popular side. Memes are great to use. You can analyze the audience for the meme, Twitter account. I mean, these are all like TikTok videos. These are all this wide array of different source material that would fit this idea of epididic. And remember, that's going to be a current representation of the source material. It can be primary or secondary. And I have a tendency to like some of these more TikTok-ish trends that have occurred out there. And then lastly, you have the deliberative sources, which has a tendency to talk about something well, it definitely talks about something in the future, but it has a tendency to be a little bit more on the legal side. Okay, so as you do the essay, try to think about analyzing things like audience for the piece, how the information is presented, this idea of ethos, which is going to be ethical, pathos, which is going to be emotional, logos, which is going to be logical. Think about all these sort of ideas of analysis of the sources and look at the way the information is presented, because that's one of the differences you'll see in the paper from a more traditional essay, argumentative. It's trying to look at the way the source material is represented, and as sort of a trick for the flow of the essay, and this is really something I think is applicable to writing across the board, especially research type of writing. If you can have source A that is maybe pro the position, right? So if you have two epidetic sources and you have one that's pro the position and you have another that's sort of like, antagonistic to the position, and you sort of use them, I'm holding my hands like paragraphs here. If you sort of use those together, you can get some pretty nice mirroring of paragraphs that occur there. So as you read over some of the example essays, just sort of take a look at them. They're really well done, and you can see sort of the different diversity in the essays. And as a note, you'll want to just have one single paraphrase. And we had the paraphrasing quiz. Make sure to add the paraphrase in there, and then the following chart, use it as a guide. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next chart. My cursor is not. Yeah. You know what? For some reason, the cursor moved in the process, so we're just going to go with that. So now here's the overview. Just remember 5 to 6 pages. That does include the works on a page. MLA, APA, whatever you want to do. And if you look here at the prompt, what you're writing about, you look at the evolution of the sources, okay? And as you read over the sources, you can see it sort of down here. I'm pointing like at the screen, right? So how, you can see at the very bottom there, how subtly or obviously are claims stated in each one of the sources below, how accurately, okay? So if you think there's a bias in the source, that's definitely something you can talk about. Is there contradictory evidence omitted between the sources? Okay, good. So now here's where you're trying to have the sources sort of like play off of each other. Okay. Now I have a tendency to like some of these more conspiratorial type of groups. Not like them. I like to analyze them. Gosh, that sounds awful, right? But sometimes they'll find a chunk of information, and there'll be some things that they sort of omit from their conspiratorial type of literature. Now, you could also make the argument that, mainstream media, that sort of thing, maybe omits some stuff too. So you can sort of flip this. There's a lot of like nuance to this essay. And then, are there unsupported claims in the sources? Or in the sources, and why? Okay, that's a good one, right? So they have some claims that they don't really substantiate. Is there evidence in the audience? Is there evidence that the article tries to refute claims and accommodations? So is it trying to like pull off of other sources? And if you can find a source that has like a reference to it, a couple years ago, I had a really good paper on Tinder. I may have mentioned this. I apologize if I bring up Tinder again, right? Which is, I think, sort of waning down. But they read an article, and they got an article from Psychology Today, right? And it was about people that use Tinder. And their first essay was that discourse community, and they got some really good interviews. And then the student was also a psych major, if that makes a difference. And what they did was they found some statistics from a study that was done of Tinder users, and they basically looked at like the demographics for it, and they looked at like the speed that somebody goes through the Tinder account, and I guess that was the whole like swipe right or left thing. Sort of glad I don't know which one is which, but the student used that data, and then they found an article that was from Psychology Today that pulled off of the academic article. So they both counted as like academic sources, but they were epidetic sources, and the accommodations between the two articles was something they talked about, and they actually mentioned what the Psychology Today, the pop psychology article focused on, and then they looked at the original study piece, and that was sort of fascinating. So if you can find a article that has a link to another article, that could be sort of like a real boon for a paper, because because you can see that they're trying to like communicate. Now for like librarians, right? Or I don't know if we have somebody that's going to be a future librarian, but that, like, I know I posed that once in a library overview, and the librarian was like, dude, like, I can't find that. It's going to be complicated. But if you do spend some time with any like Psychology Today, like a sort of a poppier but quasi-intellectual type of article, they're going to have hyperlinks. You could pull off of those. So that accommodations is that sort of connectivity. And what are the strengths and the values and the weakness of each one of the sources? And are ethos, pathos, and logos overused in the sources? So I think really those ideas there of that little list at the very bottom is going to be sort of the driving force. But also what you want to do is as you read over the article, try to as you read over the essays, examples essays I put up, just try to be sort of aware of this. It'll give you some bearings. So I think a lot of times with essay writing, we talk theoretically about it all day, but to actually read what students have done, you can sort of see the pros and the cons of it. And this chart, which is killing my eyes to look at, right, is a chart that really breaks down. And what I'll do is I'll post this chart what I'll do is I'll post an example. I have the rubric. So tonight I'll post an example of the rubric. It'll also be the previous document that is just the overview for the paper, the rubric, and then this will be at the end. And it's basically like breaks down the deliberative sources, what they're trying to achieve, the epidiotic sources, and I'm sort of pointing to the left here, the forensic sources, and basically remember that's going to be sort of future with the deliberative, epidiotic is going to be current, and then forensic is going to be about the past. And we'll sort of look at the language and the way it's set up, and we'll look at the rhetorical mode. So here's where we get a little English PhD type of analysis. But I do think that if you go forward and you're going to get PhD masters, you want to do something called a literature review. And for folks that are going to swim in that pool of the PhD world, that's going to be something that you would do almost in the proposal phase of the PhD, if I'm not mistaken about that, right? And you would basically go through and analyze literature. So I do think that this is really going to be helpful for the folks that are sort of moving forward with that. And you can see it looks at things like points of view. It looks at the structure, the methodology, the ideas of objectivity. It even looks at the idea of like passive versus active voice, which if you're going to go into like a legal type of capacity or an HR type of capacity, oh my gosh, you'll be using a lot of passive voice to sort of like hide the subject matter. So if you're grammar oriented, you could talk about sort of the tonal quality of the piece. If you had, essay one, I'm sorry, like you had deliberative source one, deliberative source two, you could look at, okay, how are these two sources different? You could look at the language of one, and you can look at the tonal quality of another, and you sort of want to mirror the analysis to reflect each other. Okay, you've got the appeals, like what type of appeals are they using for? Are they going for the deliberative source is going for like a practical type of reason? Epidiotic, and you think about like memes and that sort of thing. They're trying to build a sense of community, and they're also trying to also make some connectivity between the two groups. I know in that last video I put up with the doomer culture, which is really depressing sort of doomer culture, but also sort of funny in some ways. The students did a really good job of explaining how memes create this sense of like in-group, out-group. So memes, I think sometimes people stay away from them because it doesn't seem like we should be in college talking about memes, but they really are good for like analyzing as part of this buffet of different source material. Okay, and then you have forensic sources, which remember are going to be really sort of into the idea of being accurate. Okay, so if you're like a history major or you have that sort of like tendency, you'd look at history and try to understand what's the context, what are the 5 C's of history writing, like context, how that it's evolved over time, the factors involved with that. Okay, so that's going to be the appeal side. What you can do is just sort of look at this and then examples. Look at the examples that they use in the actual pieces. How do they establish their points of view? Think about the idea of ethos, pathos, and logos. In the deliberative sources, they're asking for a payoff. And remember, they're sort of asking for recommendations about the future. So if the paper that's about bodybuilding and it's trying to stress that maybe there's a thing going on with social media that's actually increasing body dysmorphia in males, right? Then the result that they would ask for in the future would be to build awareness for that, right? So all of that sounds pretty simple when I explain it. You would want to write that and give examples of the source material. And then this idea of epidiotic sources about people bonding or separating. oh my God, that's sort of that idea of inner outer group. So I want to say last semester there was a student, I mean, one of the continuously growing and I'd say top 5 level papers for this class is going to be anti-vaxxers, as I mentioned, right? And I had a student that looked at some pro anti-vaxxer literature, and they looked at some CDC documents that were critical, and they just talked about how like the folks that were really pro the anti-vax movement, or they would call themselves vaccine hesitant, right? They would have a different like language and way of presenting their information that was different than the CDC, and they sort of focus on different stuff. Okay, and then forensic sources is trying to make reliable information, right? So trying to establish the past. Now, you could sort of look at history and forensics as being, I use that in forensics as being like almost like a science, but you could sort of look at the idea, well, this is sort of interesting, but like say you had a primary source, right? Say you were writing about like a religious group, like a cult group, right? And you went back and you had a primary source about that, which would count as this forensic source. You could talk about the way that group sort of envisioned themselves as being like really important, or maybe they felt like things were structured around them. So you're trying to really analyze the way the information is presented, and then you have the future, which is going to be the deliberative sources, the present, which is epididic, and then lastly, the past. So what happened? Okay, so hopefully the video helps. And then what I'll do is I'll post examples of the essay. I'll make this as a separate module, and then I'll post a document, which will be the overview, the this document in a much more seeable format. Is that a word? In a much more, yeah, you can look at it and expand it. And then there'll be the rubric on there as well. Okay. So email if you need anything. Hope that helps. I appreciate everybody hanging in here with me. I get really inspired by the essays and think about these a lot, and really looking back at some other ones, I got really high expectations for it. So I think that's it.